Welcome to I Love This Movie, brought to you by Annex Theater and the Panel Jumper. In this series, we talk about the movies that we love and why we love them. On today's show, Cole Hornaday and Rob MacGregor will be discussing 2008's Cloverfield. And now your host, Cole Hornaday.
Hello, my name is Cole Hornaday, and I want to talk about 2008's Cloverfield because I love this movie. Cloverfield was never going to be the blockbuster producer J.J. Abrams and director Matt Reeves had hoped, but God did its early marketing not hook us in the lip from the drop, like the literal drop of the Statue of Liberty's head, if you want to be specific. Now, I could talk for hours about the film's breathless marketing and audience speculation and how the public possessed only fragmentary information about the film, not even its name, for months. But I think my partner in this chat hits the highlights, and so I'm going to leave that to him. I could talk at length about how Cloverfield dared to take filmgoers back to the found footage genre that still pushes a bad bank of Blair Witch buttons to this very day, but I won't. No, I want to talk about how, despite the producer's naive vision for an American kaiju franchise, he actually gave us a monster that fits us as a culture, but probably not in the ways Mr. Abrams intended. To hear Abrams tell it, the inspiration for Cloverfield came when he visited a Tokyo toy store with his son Henry. He was taken by the fact that the shelves were overrun with Godzilla toys. He just couldn't get his head around the fact that this iconic monster franchise still had meaning so many decades later. I wish we had a monster like that, he said. And my first thought upon hearing this was, if you knew better, you really wouldn't wish that. What Cloverfield should have taught us, but we were forced to learn from later disappointments, was J.J. Abrams isn't particularly interested in dramaturgy or history. And he doesn't care much for homework. He's demonstrated this repeatedly through his cavalier retooling of numerous franchises, wherein he lazily lifts elements from an established story's surface texture without regard for the culture that gave the franchise its beating heart. So, Abrams wanted to conjure up an American kaiju, but bypassed that which gave Godzilla lasting resonance. Abrams skipped the fact that Ishiro Honda's original Gojira, not Godzilla, was a horrific tale drawn from a culture struggling to reconcile the wholesale death and mass destruction courtesy of the US deployment of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first 5 films of Toho's Showa era, 1954 to 1975, Godzilla was a walking, irradiated metaphor for nuclear annihilation. Toho eventually concluded that this metaphor would not make for a sustainable franchise. And with the studio's 6th Godzilla release, Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster in 1962, Toho pivoted and transformed Godzilla into a heroic figure. The films became more lighthearted, morality plays ostensibly aimed at younger viewers. They also said, in no uncertain terms, as a culture, we need to move on from this fear and despair. Throughout this period, Toho and key competitors like Dai Studios, creator of Gamera the Flying Fire Turtle, established and refined a filmmaking language for big monster movies. This included the ubiquitous use of slow-motion photography to convey a kaiju's weight and mass. Additionally, these studios enrolled legions of craftspeople to fabricate finely detailed miniature cityscapes and cycloramas airbrushed with clouds encircling massive wading pools where actors in vulcanized rubber suits tromped their way into our imaginations. These were films that aspired to be little more than what they were, a stripped-down, low-budget, highly symbolic visual narrative. Now, in that light, Godzilla flicks are not unlike kabuki theater. The agreed-upon artifice of an actor in a rubber suit or a wobbly remote control model tank are not detractors. Indeed, they are key components in a highly refined method of storytelling. Sadly, this was not a filmmaking tradition embraced equally beyond Japanese culture. When Universal Pictures released Spielberg's Jurassic Park in 1993, my first thought was, we are never going to be able to watch Godzilla films the same way again. That is to say, the American expectation of hyperrealism in the depiction of giant monsters was now set in concrete. US audiences would no longer be willing to sit quietly for the breezy symbol systems of Godzilla flicks. And from here on out, we would expect nothing less than the representation of real, live monsters. CG was a death knell for traditional kaiju filmmaking. And for my part, Without the craftsmanship and narrative structure found in classic Showa-era Godzilla flicks, contemporary American kaiju like 2017's Kong Skull Island and 2021's Godzilla vs. Kong read as soulless and atonal. Compelling and hyper-realistic, yes, but frequently absent of charm or amusement. Toho's Showa-era celebration of childlike joy and wonder was gone. But J.J. Abrams wanted to give American culture its very own kaiju, and where Cloverfield is concerned, he succeeded. The question is, did he succeed in the ways intended? Abrams and company kicked off their Cloverfield marketing with a head-spinning, multi-platform campaign comprised of bogus websites, tantalizing teases of leaked government documents, and satirical consumer product tie-ins. And to be certain, it smacked of the Blair Witch Project's viral marketing and reiterated that selling a found footage film must include multiple platforms for fabricated assets. The sell became part of the story. Again, very American. For protagonists, we are offered monster fodder in the form of gossipy, shallow, and privileged denizens of Upper East Side Manhattan. Characters that reflected but a tiny percentage of the film's audience. At some level, this film is about eating the rich. Most of all, Cloverfield offered us a terrifying street-level experience of a kaiju attack that utilized imagery lifted directly from 9/11 news footage. This is where Cloverfield succeeds as a horror flick. But it does so at the emotional expense of those who witnessed the first terrorist attack on U.S. soil. The exploding buildings, the torrents of glass, the toxic clouds of dust and debris, the panic, the chaos were all events we saw on CNN for months. And it worked. It was exploitative as fuck, but it worked. Which at some level makes Cloverfield one very American kaiju story. Perhaps the most valuable element of Cloverfield was the emotional quality of the monster itself. Monster designer Neville Page said that he hit upon the notion that Clover was a creature newly hatched. It was a bumbling, stumbling, terrified child born into a world of ceaseless violence. When you learn this, you witness the monster in a new light. While watching the monster, you are caught in an emotional crosscurrent to which the protagonists are oblivious. And we feel for the monster while fearing it at the same time. And that is a storytelling win. Ultimately, we don't care for the fate of the privileged kids. This is a found footage flick. We know why the footage gets found. It's because those doing the recording come to a bad end. We don't get to find out what happens to the monster, and that's unfortunate. Yet, in the final analysis, Cloverfield is a worthy experiment. Cloverfield tells us a lot about who we are and why American kaiju may never be a sustainable genre. The filmmakers of Cloverfield gave us a 9/11 monster, not unlike Toho's nuclear holocaust monster. But Cloverfield is not about reconciling fear, nor is it about translating that fear into something that might ultimately bring wonder and joy. Cloverfield is about making a buck off the back of an older, cherished franchise from another culture. Now, we won't talk about Abrams' clumsy efforts at a franchise expansion with 10 Cloverfield Lane from 2016 or the Cloverfield Paradox from 2018. It's all just weird and confusing and unworthy of a prolonged discussion. It's all very American that way. And once you take that into account, Cloverfield stands as a successful exploration of what it means to make an American kaiju. And I'm good with that. And that's why I love this movie.
Because, my friends, I love this movie. I first set eyes on Cloverfield across the desolate landscape of 2007's summer blockbuster season. The roster was bleak that year, replete with disappointing sequels and reduxy schlock. There was nothing new under that summer sun, which I guess was fine considering audiences weren't particularly bothered. We all still packed into movie houses for derivative offerings like Spider-Man 3, Shrek 3, Pirates of the Caribbean 3, Ocean's 3 and Teen. So when I settled in to watch the opening night screening of Transformers, I had no expectations. All I wanted was the gentle rasp of Peter Cullen's Optimus Prime to transport me back to the Saturday mornings of my perfectly spent youth. And when I left the theater that evening, I was buzzing. Not for the film that I had just watched. No. It was for the incredible trailer before it. Attached to Transformers was the world's first look at a found footage film that seemed to document a Roland Emmerich-esque biological attack on New York City. It was vague and evocative and so wholly captured my imagination, I couldn't stop thinking about it. More importantly, it was something new. I was already in love. After sneaking into another screening of Transformers just so I could watch that trailer once more, I raced home and scoured every single movie rumor board I frequented at the time, where I found that everyone else was taken unawares, just like me. The trailer gave us no information, not even a title. All we had was a production company, Bad Robot, and a date, 1/18/08. Someone on a super underground discussion board I trolled heard that the film was called Cloverfield, but we mostly dismissed that. Movie projects often have faux working titles, as Cloverfield Boulevard is obviously the exit you take to get out to the Bad Robot Santa Monica offices. Cloverfield just seemed like the type of code name to give a secretive film like this. Nobody fucking knew anything. We were in uncharted territory and it felt so goddamn great. But before verifiable information began trickling in, the rumors surrounding the project abounded. This, after all, was a Bad Robot film, and what is a J.J. Abrams joint without hilarious and outlandish speculations? My favorite theory, which people actually believed, insisted that a line from the trailer, "I saw it, it's alive, it's huge," instead read, "I saw it, it's a lion, it's huge." And that's how too many of us came to believe that this was the trailer for a live-action Voltron film. I'm not kidding. People with fingers and opinions and internet access went to the mat for this theory. But little by little, information filtered down, and confirmations were made, often through the project's associated alternate reality game, or ARG. Now, if you're not familiar with ARGs, they're intricate virtual scavenger hunts, often used to gamify marketing. They're fun, but their narratives rarely have anything to do with the actual canon of the project they promote. Yet through this ARG, we began unraveling the actual backstory of this film, which we had come to learn was indeed titled Cloverfield. And the backstory the ARG told was, to be kind, not good. Like, at all. Not to belabor the point, but when the central tenet of your kaiju monster tale involves the Abrams universe fantasy drink Slusho and its secret ingredient, seabed nectar, you're working with a narrative foundation as sound as, you know, seabed nectar. Whatever the fuck that is. But I lose myself. This isn't I love this trailer or I love this bloated marketing campaign. What do I think of the movie? Yeah, I mean, it's all right. For a super tight 73 minutes, Cloverfield feels like a full experience. It has its flaws, but I can forgive them simply because Cloverfield is such a fresh and engaging effort. It's a truly American kaiju film, cataloging not the collective experience of massive, tentacly destruction from 10,000 feet above the action, but rather the individual's experience of it on the ground. And what is more American than making untold death and chaos a personal journey? I have no answer for that. I truly believe Cloverfield captures that individualistic experience beautifully, which is something we just don't see in kaiju films all that often. The outset of the monster's attack, as witnessed on the roof during Rob's going-away party, makes us feel truly small in its immense scope, and that's personal. The National Guard's urban assault on the monster, literally shot from the ground up, is frightening and visceral and ultimately useless, reminding us how fragile we are. The subway encounter with the parasites reinforces primal fears over predation and darkness and the unknown. And infection too, I guess, because one of the parasites bites Marlena and after a brief bout of dizziness, she just up and explodes for no reason. It's kind of weird that she explodes, right? Like, what are the physics of that? I mean, also, I wasn't done watching that character. Why make her go boom? Whatever. Listen, Cloverfield manages to capture all that as beautifully as it does because of the thing I love about it the most. It's a found footage film. This movie would simply be a different story if it were told in a different form. Told objectively, I don't think it could capture the same narrative, let alone experience for the audience. Further, I have such a deep weakness for found footage films, a medium I believe has yet to find its perfect vehicle. Cloverfield is not that perfect vehicle, but it does a lot right in this vein, and it's clear that much care went into framing it. Starting with Drew Goddard's script, which at times is overwritten, but still does the lion's share of the work here. Both Goddard and director Matt Reeves clearly put a lot of thought into the personal narratives that drive Cloverfield in hopes that we care about these characters who are wholesale destined to just get stomped or exploded or snacked on. Finally, massive eargasmy props go to the sound editors and Foley artists who mix the smoothest chaos film I've ever heard. No joke. Movie sounds real good. QED! I love Cloverfield. I love it. I loved it sight unseen, and I love it 15 years later. I love it warts and all. I love it for its weird online culture. I love it for its naivete and its wisdom. I love this movie. I do have a few bones to pick with its sequels, though, because fuck.
Hey there. Thanks for joining us here at I Love This Movie, brought to you by the Panel Jumper and Annex Theater. My name is Cole Hornaday, and across the balcony from me is...
Rob MacGregor.
I roped my dear friend Rob into doing this because he says yes to everything.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll give you a little bit of background on why we're doing this. Back at Halloween of this year, I gave myself, or October I should say, I gave myself a Halloween Writer's Challenge prompt, and I was going to write an essay about my favorite horror, sci-fi, fantasy flick a day. And I think I got about 25 essays deep, and then I got this really lousy GI tract problem that landed me in the ER, and I kind of ran out of, I was going to say I ran out of gas.
Hey!
But I ran out of forward momentum, and so I didn't finish. The 26th or the 27th piece I was going to write was going to be about Cloverfield. Well, in the interim time, Steve McCandless, managing director of Annex Theater, and my partner, my panel jumper partner in crime, Mr. Ben Laurance, said, hey, we don't have anything going on at Annex. Let's figure out how we can do streaming stuff and engage an audience. So we're engaging you right now. So Cloverfield, Rob and I discovered we had a mutual fondness and distrust for this film about a year and a half ago. And we've actually been talking a lot about found footage flicks because, as Rob mentioned in his essay, it is a genre that has still sparks a lot of inspiration and imagination, and yet has still never found its footing genre-wise, and is it even fair to call it a genre yet?
I don't know if it's fair to call it a genre at all, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's a modality. It's a way for us to do films, but it is. And I also don't even know if it will ever find its true footing or the vehicle that it needs. I don't even know if that's possible. But I love watching people attempt it because it's just so much fun.
Yeah, it is, and because there are tropes. It was a tropeless approach to storytelling when Blair Witch hit the ground. And yet, over time, we start seeing different modalities of telling the story. I don't think modality is the right word, but methods of telling the story. Yeah. And one of them is this sort of cross-platform thing with the bogus websites, with the bogus products. Oh, by the by, Rob MacGregor, in his brilliance, went and got slushies at 7-Eleven up the street and whipped together a graphic for the cup, so that we're actually drinking in this reality our version of Slusho. So anyway,
You could really taste the seabed nectar.
yeah, seabed nectar. So I think I told you there's a documentary on Shudder right now about found footage films. And it was really interesting, and it's really long. And they talk a lot about all these different found footage films, the ones that work, like Wreck, and how the genesis of the whole thing. And they talk about The Last Broadcast and these other films like that. And there's that one that that's the VHS home movie of the family in the Ozarks or someplace getting abducted by aliens, and it's very, very zero budget, but so charming and creepy at some really effective level. Anyway, do you think Cloverfield would have worked as if it was not a found footage film?
No. I mean, well, I like I mentioned in my piece, I don't think it would be the same story. I don't think you could tell that story the same way, or at least convey the exact same experience that the audience has had, if you weren't experiencing it from the ground up. If you weren't experiencing it from the perspective of the people who are actually in the thick of it, which is one of the things. Well, I know we'll probably get to the sequels at some point, or we don't have to, but at some point we might discuss them. One thing that truly disappointed me about the sequels is that they never expand on more other people's versions of what's going on. For instance, there's this great moment in the film where they're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge just before the tentacle comes down and kills Jason, who is Rob's brother, on the Brooklyn Bridge. And HUD, the person who's using the camera, pans over, and there's another person with another camera that you see that holds HUD's focus for a second, and that made that captured my imagination, making me think, God, we've got a sequel right there. Somebody else's experience, all the shit that they've gone through, all the stuff that they had to go through. We could see whole different worlds of this one big massive experience. And
what do you think? Do you think it should be the same night? Do you think it should be another the following day? Should it be the aftermath of? Because clearly they nuke New York.
Yeah.
You know, what do you think what would you like to see?
I would have loved to seen like the same day, but like different aspects of the same day. Because we get, in terms of the threats of the film itself, we get the Cloverfield monster, the big thing. Mm-hmm. We've got the little parasite guys who go around making people explode by biting on them. Because that makes sense. I mean, it's indubitably dope. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's fucking awesome, right? But like, what's going on there? We don't even know. We never know. We never figure it out. But perhaps we could figure out from a different perspective, right? Or we could get like maybe there are more other weird, horrible things that pop out of the harbor as well, not just this one monster and his little cooties.
Let's see. Got a question from Jim. Do found footage films tend to privilege the initial experience over deep analysis? And which one holds up best to deeper analysis, in your opinions?
That question needs deep analysis, Jim. But thank you for asking it, brother.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jim Jewell. I think that found footage films do privilege the initial experience. I think because I think they're kind of meant to be that sort of visceral thing. You're supposed to just basically take it on its surface, what the actual thing is, versus I think found footage films, maybe one of the reasons why I like them is because you don't have to think too much about them. It's just a recounting of the experience, but it's cobbled together in such a way that it gives you some kind of cohesive narrative.
Well, and it's a narrative that for me reads as, I almost want to say hyper-realistic, because growing up in the age of technology, of videotape, and now live feeds, when I first saw the Blair Witch Project, it had such an incredibly visceral response to me, because everything on that was real, because it was on home video, because it was so crude and unpolished. And it struck me. And of course, I think one of the reasons why people despise that film is they are really, really grumpy about the fact that they had the wool pulled over their eyes. I think a lot of people were like, oh, you lied to me. I'm like, no, that's good theater. Mm-hmm. You got caught up in some really good theater. Now, I also know for a fact that there is another faction of people who despise it because it made them physically ill to watch.
Sure.
And this is kind of like, considering the fact that this is the kid whose parents had to pull over on long trips so he could puke in the ditch, because I got car sick so often. I was totally engaged in that film, and I never got motion sickness. But there's a lot of resentment about the fact that trying to watch that film was a really frustrating experience for people. But to me, it was hyper real, and there's that aspect of this too, where you are looking through the experiencer's eyes at the street level. And I, for one, don't question the narrative. And I know a lot of people would say, like, this gets really ridiculous when they're climbing over the buildings at the end. They're climbing out onto the building. I'm like, no, I'm still with it.
Yeah.
I'm still with it, because it's ridiculous from the drop. And yet there's an aspect of there's a reality that is cohesive to me in this film.
Well, so. there was a character. I mean, there was a character who was literally impaled by the building. Like Beth, who was sitting there with a chunk of rebar going through her lungs for ostensibly hours.
Right.
Who's then pulled off, and then suddenly she's running away from the monster.
Yeah.
You don't just. No. You can't really question those things. Just go with it. It's fine. Yeah. It's fine.
So it looks like Brian had a comment about the I'm going to strongly argue that a series of movies in which dubiously linked plots are cobbled together into weak continuity is completely in line with the kaiju tradition. Were you talking about the sequels, or are you talking about just the narrative of this film in itself? Because it sounds like we feel obliged to the level to talk about these sequels that are not really sequels.
Yeah, they're definitely not sequels.
Yeah, they're orphan movies that got the Bad Robot stamp on them, and it's really kind of frustrating. But at the same time, when I got hip to the fact that these were actually tied to the Cloverfield, 10 Cloverfield Lane and Cloverfield Paradox were actually somehow tied to the Cloverfield film, I thought that they
Spiritual siblings is what J.J. Abrams called them.
I thought that they were, and mind you, I am present the fact that I'm giving them way too much credit, that they were some aspect of Brian Eno's oblique strategies, where you take non-corresponding ideas, you put them in a hat or a bowl, you mix them up, you put them out on the table, and you force your creativity to create connective tissue between these ideas. I thought that was maybe happening there.
And you were wrong.
I'm a turkey. No, I'm not even close to being right.
Because it's not. And Brian, by the way, thank you for your comment, and thank you for contributing. I think you said it best when we read this prior to going live. Is that you said I think that it's a little too kind to call them even dubiously linked, because these movies are linked to Cloverfield basically just by branding alone, and that's. And I mean, you'll never hear somebody from Bad Robot say this. And obviously, this is speculation. I'm a middle-aged white dude with a beard on the internet with an opinion. So don't take my shit or take my shit with a grain of salt. But if you give it just a moment of thought, like for instance, 10 Cloverfield Lane, it becomes quite clear that it was never out of the gate meant to be a Cloverfield sequel.
No.
It was originally written as a film called The Cellar. Spec script written by a couple of young playwrights, and then Dan Casey, who wrote like the Fast and Furious 9, came around and did some rewrites later on. But it was originally being produced under Insurge Productions, which is a imprint house for Paramount. They decided, or they realized, okay, we made Paranormal Activity, which is a very, very popular film that had a very, very small budget. And it's like, well, shit, we can actually do more with this. So they created Insurge, which is, like I said, an imprint that was based off of micro budgeted films, $5 million or less, something like that. They did a couple of things like they did a Katy Perry concert documentary series, along with I think a Justin Bieber one as well. The Cellar was meant to be produced, or rather is being produced by Bad Robot, but was being distributed by Paramount's Insurge under the Insurge umbrella. And then in 2015, Insurge went under, and all their products, all their titles are being shelved. So you put two and two together, it doesn't take much to realize that J.J. Abrams and et al. Amongst Bad Robot said, hey, you know what we need to do? We've already put $5 million in this thing. It's going to make a lot of money, especially if we slap a Cloverfield on it.
Right.
Or say, here, we have this other property that's not doing anything right now. We can go ahead and just create this thing. And at first I thought, okay, that's interesting, because like then you have, cool, Cloverfield can then become sort of this anthology style series of things. And by the way, the 10 Cloverfield Lane, I love that film. I think it's a good film.
Oh, it's fascinating.
I mean, John Goodman is amazing in it.
Yeah.
Mary Elizabeth Winstead is fantastic as well. John Gallagher Jr. is fucking phenomenal. Even Bradley Cooper. he was the boyfriend at the beginning.
Right.
You just hear his voice. Fantastic cast, really well done, really well acted, really well written. It didn't need to be a Cloverfield joint at all.
No.
It didn't for it to be a satisfying and lovely film.
Right.
So despite the fact that it is sort of under this umbrella of Cloverfieldom, I think 10 Cloverfield Lane is a fine film.
Sure.
Just doesn't need to be a fucking Cloverfield film.
And what's your take on the Cloverfield Paradox?
Fuck that film so hard, Jesus Christ. Well, that's another film. That's another film that I don't know whether or not. stand that film. So bad. It's so bad. I mean, the fact that you have, at some point, like, you could tell that film also was shot. It was in the can, and there was stuff that was just crammed in willy-nilly in the end. Even like the embarrassing like Donald Logue interview bits where he's sitting there going like, if you turn on this machine, you're gonna see Cloverfield monsters from another dimension. Embarrassingly bad, horrible film. Holy shit.
Yeah, in this, and I watched the whole film asking, what does this have to do with, what does this have to do with anything? Because this is before I knew that Bad Robot was basically attempting to financially rescue orphaned movies, but then to have this utterly out of scale Cloverfield monster rear up out of the stratosphere.
The size of fucking Everest as well. It was huge.
I mean, I was so confused, and I thought, oh, is okay? Am I supposed to lie in wait, or am I supposed to wait patiently for the next film where all of these things come together? Because that was the narrative I was constructing in my head, and I think that at some level they wanted me to be constructing like something like that. Hence the oblique strategies, and then I learned from a friend that, oh no, this is just eggs they threw in a basket together.
Pretty much, yeah. Absolutely. It was originally a film called God Particle. That was the name of the film originally.
That's right.
Which leads me to believe that it was something that was also in the can, but then they just sort of said, let's go ahead and clovey it.
Yeah.
Let's just give it some clove. Just give it some clovey. Just throw a little clovey in there.
So before we went in front of the camera, and while our pre-recorded essays were rolling, you asked me something along the lines of, do you think that Cloverfield is a successful American kaiju? And I didn't have an answer for you, and I'm going to turn the tables and ask you, do you think it's a successful American kaiju, and what does it mean to have a successful American kaiju? Right.
Okay. So the spirit of the question was, like, for instance, we know that, like, as you mentioned in your monologue, that Godzilla is a metaphor for nuclear annihilation and irradiated wastes. Which is absolutely true. In fact, I had a conversation a few years ago with a friend about Japanese cinema and what have you, and he sat there and said, wow, I never really put it together. Japan has a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff. It seems like they're kind of obsessed with post-apocalyptic stuff. I wonder why that is. And I was like,
really?
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 Maybe because they're post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that like Godzilla is, I'd say, soup to nuts, a Japanese, like, a truly Japanese character. That makes a lot of sense. What would the American version of that be, right? Like, what would it tap into? What would it tap into? Our own horrors, our own traumas, our fears. What would it tap into? What are our traumas and fears? Well, considering that the backstory of Cloverfield is that the Cloverfield monster was asleep at the bottom of the harbor in New York, and was awoken by a satellite that fell from the sky that you see at the very, very end of the film, by the way.
If you're eagle-eyed enough, you see it when they're on the Ferris wheel. It drops and splashes in the distance. I saw it right away, but I saw the film in this theater, so it was a little bit more visible to me than it would be on a smaller screen. But did you catch it right away?
I did, but I also knew to look for it because I was hooked into this film.
Oh, okay.
I was reading everything I could about it online, especially when people were giving their first impressions, their first looks. But here's the thing. So the backstory, at least the one that's given in the ARG for this film, is that the satellite falls into the water, awakening this monster that had been sleeping there for a while, but it was still a baby. It wakes up, it eats this thing called seabed nectar, and becomes enraged and larger because of it or something, I don't know. And so seabed nectar is ostensibly the secret ingredient of this thing that J.J. Abrams puts in every single one of his shows and films called Slusho. because of that, I would say that the Cloverfield monster is a direct result of of consumerism,
Right.
And of over farming and of
Or the
taxing our
monster's
resources.
just,
So maybe yes, it is the most American monster you could
Or
imagine.
maybe just the monster's, nectar intolerant.
Right, exactly.
Maybe we need to lean into more sympathy for this which we need. I am actually quite sympathetic for this monster, and that's what's kind of weird. And I think that successful kaiju at some level, there's sympathy for them. If you've seen the original Gojira, the un-Americanized version, I highly recommend it. I think Criterion put out, I didn't even know it existed until, 20 years ago when Criterion put out the anniversary edition. And I thought that the expurgated Raymond Burr version I thought that's the film that was the original film.
Right.
No concept that there is a much darker, much more critical and viciously satirical film out there, and that we finally got a chance to see. So I highly recommend Gojira. And actually, if you have a chance, watch Gojira side by side with this and see what kind of connection you find between the two. What do you got?
Well, Duncan Harrison, my buddy Duncan, asks, it seems like much of the magic in found footage films and their associated marketing is that they make it easier to suspend disbelief. Mm-hmm. How could this format work today when it's no longer novel? That's a great question, Duncan. Thank you for asking it. I think that you use the same technology that you use in your own head that whenever you go to see, any other film, whether it be a Star Wars film or a film that captures your imagination in any other way. It's no longer a novel means of telling stories, found footage films.
Well, I think it's rooting the story in rooting the story in a contrived reality that we buy. I mean, that's you got the platforms, you got the products, and for my part, you've got this film that is, when I see things on video, I still feel that it's real. I don't know if that answers your question. I think I'm just reiterating everything you just said.
One thing I always look for whenever I watch a found footage film, one thing that I always judge the found footage film on is whether or not they keep everything diegetic. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by diegetic? It's a big filmmaking word. Diegetic usually is in reference to something that is musical usually, but it can be applied to other things. That means it's happening within the actual film, mm-hmm. right? It's happening to the characters. So imagine Darth Vader, entering or coming in, and from his shuttle, and you hear his music. That music, that's not diegetic. That John Williams score, mm-hmm. Which is beautiful, one of my favorite pieces of his, is not diegetic. But if you were to pan over, and then you see a stormtrooper taking the needle off of a Victrola as it's playing, and the music stops, that would be diegetic music. One thing that's important for found footage films, in my opinion, is whether or not everything remains happening that you see is happening within the actual story itself to the characters, mm-hmm. and you don't see them slip up and accidentally make a weird cut or an edit or something like that just seems out of place. All the footage that you find needs to make sense.
So we're talking about turning the metaphorical lens back on the story?
I don't know. I was just thinking that one of the things that makes found footage films for me, or it keeps me in found footage films, is mm-hmm. whether or not they kind of follow their own rules.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, a found footage film is a limitation. You're limited by what you can do with it. You can't just have suddenly stop using found footage stuff and then suddenly have a dope ass 3D rendered cut scene or something like that. You need to keep it within camera.
Right.
And so I was just basically commenting on that's what I look for. That's what keeps me in found footage films, is whether or not they follow their own rules. Because after all, that's a limitation, and limitation is what breeds ingenuity and genius choices.
I was thinking about how the new Battlestar Galactica shot the fight scenes in space, and they shot them to look like a documentary. They were like,
Yeah.
There were whip pans. There were these
zooms.
There were very self-conscious zooms, but it was never established that we were looking through the eye of an observing camera. That just became how we told the story of space fights in that story, and it actually fabricated this layer of reality in what we were watching. We're watching the news.
Yeah.
Don't know from where it's being broadcast from. We're watching the fight between the Cylons and the colonists out in space, and it's on the news. It immediately strikes that processing aspect in our brain. And I think that's what a lot of found footage does. For me, it's like it immediately taps into that, says, this is real.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, Hardcore Henry is fun. That is a very fun film, says Steven. Yeah, that film is just, I don't know. That's a meth trip.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, you haven't?
That's when it's all from the protagonist's point of view.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's all super action and ridiculous, over the top.
And how is that contrived that we're watching through his eyes in that film?
I can't remember.
Because he's not carrying around a camera.
No. It's just all his perspective.
Yeah,
I can't quite
okay.
remember whether or not he's some sort of cyborg thing or whatnot. Okay. I just remember that it's hyper fun and just a good Papa Wheelie style film. What did you think of the sequels? I know I sounded off. What did you?
Oh, I just thought they were infuriating because I was and confusing because I did think that we were working with this oblique strategy thing, and I was trying to create connective tissue as to how these all fit together. And then someone pointed out relatively recently, like 2 years ago, said, "Oh no, those are just orphan movies." And I did like 10 Cloverfield Lane a lot. I liked being blindsided at the end. I'm going to give away the ending. So,
Jim, cover your ears.
All right, no, I won't give it away. But like, I didn't see that coming, and it was weird, but strangely fulfilling when we get to that ending moment, because it sends a shockwave back through everything you just watched. But in retrospect of 2 years, how many years later, to learn that this was an orphan film that got rebranded, I thought then that actually what they did was cheapen a really great drama.
Yeah, right. Agreed.
By putting this twist on the end.
Agreed.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate.
There's one thing that Cloverfield Paradox did really, really well.
What's that?
It announced itself and then was available to watch. Like, it announced itself at the Super Bowl at halftime. It's like, come see Cloverfield Paradox. It's on Netflix right after the game. And then they did it. And I thought, all right, that's a lot. That's fun.
Yeah.
And you got me. And then they spent the next hour and a half pissing me off.
Yep, me too. Before we went live, you asked me about sequels to the immediate Cloverfield. So Cloverfield Prime.
Right.
How would we have a sequel to that? How could that push how could that help push the American Kaiju agenda forward? If there were sequels, what would those look like? And I'm asking.
You're asking me, okay.
Yeah. You had that look of like, Cole, are you asking? You're telling me.
No, I thought that this was a setup for something. Well, like I said, like what would the sequel to Cloverfield look like? Ideally, for me,
yeah,
I would love to have seen the story of the dude that you saw on the Brooklyn Bridge.
More monsters, new monsters,
maybe new. I mean, whatever, or just
Monster
different
fights?
experiences. Different experiences. Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing, just getting a little more information. I mean, we can go ahead and be prosaic about our sequels and just go ahead and just, kind of give out a little more information as we go.
Because as a Godzilla freak, my brain goes to the immediate sequel to Gojira, which was called Godzilla Raids Again, where I think earlier, and I just rewatched it a couple months ago, and of course now I've forgotten everything about it. But it opens with the first kaiju fight with Anguirus, the one who looks like an Ankylosaurus and an armadillo hybrid, and they're fighting on this iceberg, and they're being observed by a fella who the character I read somewhere was actually a had gotten bounced out of the Japanese Air Force. So he lived with a certain degree of shame because he could not be a kamikaze pilot and die with honor, and now is flying around for a fishing firm, and he spies the monster. I do recommend it. It's a weird sequel, but I can't help but pull imagery, ideas, storytelling devices from that immediate sequel to Godzilla for Cloverfield 2. The haranguing. So.
I also wouldn't mind, because one thing that I haven't actually, I've skimmed it, I haven't read it. There is a prequel manga.
Oh, really?
For Cloverfield, called Cloverfield Kishin, or Cloverfield Angry God.
I didn't know that. That's great.
Which kind of goes into Tagruato, who's one of the, basically, ultimately, one of the companies that Rob is going to go work for when he goes into Japan. Also, one of the companies that John Goodman works for in 10 Cloverfield Lane that he retired from. Or rather, he retired from Bold Futura, which is a subsidiary of Tagruato. But it goes into the story of a Cloverfield monster who basically comes out of the Sea of Japan and kind of gives us a little bit of interesting backstory there. I wouldn't mind seeing something like that.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, I'd be okay if the movie just stood on its own. You know what I'm saying?
But still, it's an American blockbuster movie, and at a certain level, it's like you feel cheated because they didn't go. I mean, their efforts at exploiting their audience went in this other direction that are lame, and it's like, no. You said something earlier tonight about how sequels are cynical.
Yeah. Well, rather these sequels are cynical.
Okay. Not sequels in general.
10 Cloverfield Lane and Cloverfield Paradox are definitely cynical sequels because they're just self-serving for the studio. They don't actually serve the narrative. They don't push anything forward or give us any. They're not revelatory in any way.
I thought I was listening with half an ear, so I thought you were referring to sequels in general. The whole process of studios generating sequels is cynical.
I'm not gonna hitch to that fucking post, mate. No, man. Aliens is not cynical. Aliens is dope.
Oh, see, that's a whole other. I love this movie. We could talk about the sequels that win, that succeed.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah, that's a great conversation. So we'd need more Slusho for that one.
No doubt. Or for Aliens, it would be something else. Yeah. Steven says that in the Blair Witch era, it was still possible to not know things. Mm-hmm. Now that social media is ubiquitous, we are more worried about spoilers than being intrigued by an ARG. I think you're right. I actually have a friend who refuses nowadays to watch trailers. He will not watch trailers anymore. He'll watch teasers if they first hit, but he won't go search them out, nor will he actively watch a trailer because they give us too much information these days. Basically, you get nearly the entire story in 2.5 little minute chunks. So yeah, it's hard to keep your brain virginal and your perspective unbesmirched by information these days because it's all at our fingertips.
Do we have any other questions from the chat? No? All right. So we've been rocking and rolling here for about 48 minutes. I feel complete.
I feel complete too.
All right. I want to thank. What's that?
I feel full of seabed nectar.
Hey. I want to thank our camera person, Mr. Webster Wick Polk over here, and of course Ben Laurance, our producer. I want to thank Steve McCandless for twisting my little finger and convincing me this would be a good idea because it was a good idea. And of course, I want to thank Annex Theater as well. This was an experiment. I feel that it was a very successful experiment. We're going to look into how we can make this happen going forward. We welcome your feedback, your constructive criticism, but not your mean and bullying criticism because there's no room for that anymore. Right. So yeah, we'll just censor you. Anyway, I'm Cole Hornaday.
I'm Rob MacGregor.
And thank you for watching I Love This Movie.